Well, for more now on China-EU relations, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Chen Chenchen. She's the Deputy Director of the Macro Research Department at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. Also with us from Hong Kong is Tim Summers. He's a Senior Consulting Fellow with the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House and author of China's Regions in the Era of Globalization. Here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He focuses on the Asia-Pacific region as a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Massachusetts, Philippe Le Corre is a senior fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School and author of China's Offensive in Europe. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Chen Chenchen, let's start in Beijing. There was some concern about the outcome of this meeting, how it would end. The South China Morning Post reported there were fears that there might not be a joint statement from the two sides because there were fears that the differences between the two sides were so wide. But we did have a joint statement, a draft statement that came out. So what can we conclude from the fact that there was a joint statement?
Well, I don't think it actually matters so much whether the two sides can have this joint releasement of communique, because actually the general tone is already there. We know that in the past time they have been struggling amid Europeans whether how they are going to position China. So now it's increasingly clear that China is being labeled as more a cooperator rather than competitor. Although there are still politicization of some minority issues, but generally the tone is there. So if you review the history of the interaction between the two sides, you can actually see that, especially in late 1980s or early 1990s, there have been serious setbacks in this bilateral relationship. But now there are steady progress, either in the general volume of trade, but also in many other areas like climate change, like technology. So I would say that the basic agreement on a draft signals very positively. Naidu.
Right, Philippe, what do you think? Has there been a change in tone, a change in the nature of this relationship from one where China is considered, well, it was called a systemic rival not so long ago, but is it now being seen as more of a partner?
So I think, China is a systemic rival of the EU because the systems are different. So it's as simple as that. But if you look at the past 3 years, there were 2 years without a joint communique, and 2 years, including today, with a joint communique. So it's good news for EU-China relations. Especially, it includes agreements on lifting discriminatory measures in China and giving more access to European companies. And it involves also the notion of human rights and as a universal value, which is something that the Chinese side was not necessarily in agreement with. So I think, it's a good base for discussion. And also that means that, the art of the deal might be also a European concept, not just an American one.
Right, and Philippe, the big issue for the Europeans was Chinese market access. What's your reading on that? Do you think the Europeans got what they wanted?
Well, I mean, in terms of protection, the investment protection framework, I think that's pretty good news. The idea that state aid will be also controlled and that will be sort of monitored from both sides. There will be the elimination of discriminatory requirements and practices affecting foreign investors. And generally, we're talking about, mutual benefits. That means basically that's a way of implementing the law that was passed during the National People's Congress in Beijing just a few weeks ago. Now we will have to wait and see, of course, next year when that law is being put into practice. But at least this communique, this joint declaration is fairly coherent and complete, I would say, from a European point of view. But we will have to wait and see, because as you said, it's not just European companies that have been complaining about the lack of market access in China. It's also Americans and other countries as well. So China is now opening its eyes to the fact, it's been building national champions in its own markets, which is fine, yeah, but also restricting access to a number of foreign players. And I think, this declaration is somewhat putting the bar in the middle, which is you know, a good outcome.
All right, let's go to Tim Summers in Hong Kong. And Tim, during last month's meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, as well as the French President Emmanuel Macron, said they wanted a fairer trade relationship with China. There's this big talk about reciprocity. We heard that word several times. Did this meeting, this summit, go some way towards addressing that?
I think it's probably helpful in addressing those European concerns, you know, which have grown over a number of years now. These are not new points being made by European leaders. And so I think that, you know, the sense in Europe that China has become a more challenging and more difficult market for their companies to operate in is one that's, you know, become quite well established. And the statement, the comments by China's leaders, by Premier Li Keqiang and others about ensuring fair treatment and market access are welcome. But I think most European companies will be looking to see what happens next. How are these promises implemented, how quickly and how well over the coming years?
All right, and Sourabh, you've been doing a lot of work on this, and what Tim just said is key. It's implementation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's implementation. It'll come down to it. And we'll get to see actually very soon in terms of the implementation, because the foreign investment law, which was passed on March 15th at the Two Sessions meeting, that goes into effect on January 1st, 2020. And that means the implementing rules, guidelines, regulations need to be written. And it's actually good that it's got to be written in a way quickly, because we need to get this, the ball needs to move fast on this. And it also, because the foreign investment law itself was passed in a short period of time in terms of debate, it was also written fairly broadly. So it gives the State Council the liberty to frame those implementing guidelines in the detail it wants to and with as much liberalizing intent it wants to. So I'm very hopeful on this front, and we will see the results soon.
There was also talk on technology transfers. You know, the United States and Europe are on the same page as far as that's concerned.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. They're on the same page. And let me also say, actually, the interests of all parties, including China, are aligned on this front. Here's why. China is a huge market, and the EU and American companies are thirsting to get into the market and make investments there, but not at the expense of having to de facto, in a way, surrender their technology. They want this to be fair, and it needs to be reciprocal. For China, China has a huge innovation ecosystem, but much of that ecosystem is dependent on core technologies that Americans and Europeans produce. And so it does not want to be excluded by way of foreign investment screening barriers or export control laws. Right. So China wants to liberalize so as to meet American and Western expectations, so it can have access to those technologies. And in return, and so to help its innovation ecosystem, and in return for that, it's willing to have this fair and liberal and non-discriminatory investment regime, which the Americans and the Europeans are, as I said, thirsting for. So I believe at the end of the day, there's an alignment of interests, and I think we are moving in that direction at this point of time.
Chen Chenchen, as we heard from our reporter in Brussels, both sides also talked about reforms of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, especially industrial subsidies. This is what Donald Tusk, the European Council President, said. Let's watch this.
Both sides will intensify the discussions with the aim of strengthening international rules on industrial subsidies. It is a breakthrough. For the first time, China has agreed to engage with Europe on this key priority for WTO reform.
So, Chen, we heard there Donald Tusk call this a breakthrough. How significant is this?
Well, I think it's a very substantial and interesting step that both sides have made. Because if you look at the stance from the Trump administration in Washington, you will see that the U.S. is actually trying to withdraw from such international institutions. After the end of the Second World War, actually, it was the U.S. that helped found the existing institutions, not just WTO, but also IMF and United Nations. So this World Trade Organization is actually a very important pillar and a column in the current existing institutions. When the United States wants to withdraw, other key players like China, like the EU, they are trying to undertake the responsibility of keep maintaining the existing order and also reforming it. And more importantly, I think specifically the reform on the industrial subsidies is in accordance with China's domestic reform. Because if you look at the enterprises, especially involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, many state-owned enterprises are involved in infrastructure projects, but China is now saying, especially amid the 2 sessions that have just concluded, that it will give more priority to the private sector. It will boost the level of transparency. So if China wants to further continue this path of reform and opening up, of course, it wants to conduct substantial reforms, like on the subsidy issue, and also to guarantee a fair market environment as much as possible.
Philippe, what did you make of the announcement on industrial subsidies?
So I think it's very good news, obviously. The WTO, obviously, we know that there are a lot of discussions about China as a member of the WTO. It's been part of the debate on both sides of the Atlantic. So the fact that China and the EU are going to be trying to reform the WTO is good news. Remember also that China has been suing the EU for not granting China the market economy status a couple of years ago. So it hasn't been completely without controversies. But I think the subsidy issue and state subsidies is critical. And also, I would add, to follow up the previous speaker, I would add that if there were more private companies investing in Europe, they would probably be better perceived, perhaps. And the fact that normal businesses would interact with their counterparts in Europe, that would be easier to understand for many of the local players.
Tim Summers, so we had a lot of positive things come out of the meeting, but I'm wondering if there are mixed signals coming out of the European Union on China trade relations. For example, the EU was not very happy with the Chinese signing that bilateral Belt and Road deal with Italy. In fact, as we pointed out earlier, the EU described China as a systemic rival. What is the European position? Do they want all these deals that China has with Europe to go through Brussels?
I think, to be honest, it's just become a lot more complicated over recent years. I think there's been there's growth in debate within Europe about how to deal with China. And that's debate between countries, but it's also debate within countries. I think there's a sort of shift in the centre of gravity of European positions to be a little bit more sceptical and a little bit more critical of China over the last few years. That's not just on trade and economic issues; it's also on things like human rights, which, as Philippe mentioned, does feature, I think, quite prominently in the joint statement from the summit. So. The European policy making on China has got a lot more complicated and more challenging. That's partly the nature of the European Union. You have your supranational bodies, but you also have your member states with their own interests and approaches. So I think this is natural. I think this is going to continue because there are divided interests across Europe in how to deal with China. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge to coordinate that successfully at the European level.
Right, and I guess, Tim, there are also differences, well, Northern Europe and Southern Europe, because China has bilateral deals not just with Italy, but with Greece as well, with Portugal as well. Is there also concern over that?
I think on the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, perhaps there is this slight sort of north-south difference, but not totally. I mean, some of the end of the routes under the Belt and Road go into Northern Europe, into Germany, into Holland. I mean, that perhaps feeds back into some of this intra-European debate about the Belt and Road Initiative. The UK, which of course is probably going to leave the European Union fairly shortly, has actually been quite positive in its response to the Belt and Road Initiative as well as a Northern European fairly liberal economy. So it's I think a little bit more complicated than a north-south division over this.
Sourabh, let's look at this meeting in Brussels from a different angle, and that is, if we look at what came out of the meeting, the joint communique, to what extent was that a message to Washington, to President Trump, that we're now in a multilateral world?
That's a really important point, and even, we talked about in a multilateral world, and we think generally in terms of political multilateralism, but even on the trade and investment front, I mean, it is a signal to Washington that the EU and China are engaging on trade and investment and hope to have a comprehensive agreement on investment. The EU and Japan already have an FTA. The comprehensive progressive TPP is undergoing. And so at the end of the day, it might be the US which itself marginalizes itself if it is not willing to strike deals with these countries and will probably have to face non-preferential terms in their markets. So it kind of puts a little bit of pressure on the US too, to be honest, in these negotiations. Seen more broadly beyond economics and investment, there's obviously a signal. It's very clear in the joint statement when they talk about Iran and the deal that they had, and they mention there have been 14 instances of reporting by the IAEA saying that Iran is upholding its obligations, right, and those sort of these things. That's a kind of a jab pointed at Washington that these two countries are hoping to have a rules-bound order. And unilateralism sits awkwardly with that rules-bound order. And so I think this is an important signal that EU and China deepen their ties, not to exclude Washington, but to give a signal to Washington that it too must engage in this process.
All right. Chen Chen, given the trade dispute between the United States and China right now, how important is it for China to strengthen this relationship with the European Union?
Well, I think we are now facing this very interesting world that the United States is absent from many important areas, not just trade, but also key areas in global governance. So when I talk to my colleagues, not just in China, but also in Europe, we often discussing the problem, how the countries today are going to handle the issues when the United States is absent. So specifically to the trade issue, I think many countries are diversifying their sources. So just a few months ago, for China itself, it held the Shanghai Import Expo, and not just European countries are invited, but also, of course, American enterprises also came, a few of them, but many African countries, South American countries also sent delegations and companies. So I think China is vigorously approaching this issue through diversifying both the import and export sources, and Europe is, of course, a very important part of that, Naidu.
Philippe, that's one way of looking at it. If we look at it another way, the fact that the United States is being told you have to get with the program right now or you risk isolation. But if you look at the hardline attitude or position that President Trump has taken, has that in some way emboldened the Europeans to adopt a similar stance with the Chinese in their negotiations?
Well, you could say that. I would probably agree with that comment. I think, the Europeans for many years have been sort of complaining about what I was referring to, the lack of market access, state subsidies, the fact that, the Chinese market is dominated by national players. And in a way, President Trump has sort of voiced concerns that were also valid in Europe and across Europe, even though the countries that perhaps wanted to express this the most were Germany, France, the UK, some of the large countries, the Netherlands. And the fact that the US president actually brought China in the discussion was, I think, a strong element, and many Europeans acknowledge this. The other thing is, you could argue that China also is going through a negotiation with the US at the moment over trade. There's a trade dispute going on. And having a deal with the Europeans was somewhat very important this time because they wanted some success. I mean, can you imagine Premier Li Keqiang leaving Brussels without a joint communique this time. So I think, you know, we're talking about negotiating a deal with the US on one side, with the EU. Now we're talking mainly about bilateral investment agreements. I think that's what both sides are trying to negotiate, again, because Chinese investments have been thriving all over the world through the Belt and Road or without the Belt and Road. In fact, you know, it's been a trend for about 5 or 6 years now. And it's an important moment. And I think the fact the Europeans and the Chinese have agreed on many issues, like the ones we've been discussing today, is a signal to Washington. At the same time, you know, it's also a good outcome for the Europeans.
Tim, I want to get your thoughts on another issue that's been discussed, and that the European Union has called for a review of cybersecurity risks related to 5G technology. But the Europeans did say that they will not ban the Chinese tech giant Huawei. Here's the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker.
To be clear, we are not targeting specific vendors or countries. We have an open market, and everybody who complies with the rules can access it. The question is to combine, to match security and innovation. Both go hand in hand.
So it appears that that Europe has a very different view on Huawei from the United States. And the United States, of course, has been urging its partners in Europe to ban Huawei as well. Is that a significant change on or the European point of view? Is that different?
Yeah, I think the European point of view on Huawei and other Chinese tech companies has been different from that in the US for a number of years now. There's nothing new in the sort of transatlantic difference on how to deal with these players. And one of the things that makes that difference pertinent today is that I think many European economies and governments have got quite long experience of dealing with Huawei in particular, and that's generally been good and positive experience for them. So I think that also explains the difference in approach. 5G itself is, I think, becoming a complicated issue irrespective of China and of individual companies, because it sort of suggests quite a significant leap in technological application, which European governments are maybe thinking now a little bit more carefully about how they deal with and about what that means. But I think where the Commission's come out on this is quite sensible. Continue working with Chinese companies that have got a good track record in Europe, and look at the 5G issue on the sort of its technical merits.
So what are your thoughts on what the Europeans... Sorry, go ahead, Philippe. Yeah.
Sorry, I think at the end of the day, you know, national governments are going to decide on this, and particularly security agencies will have a strong voice. It's not just going to be economy ministries, but, you know, there are concerns from a number of, you know, defense establishment representatives on Huawei, and unfortunately, that will be, you know, a factor.
So what do you make of it? Because this is very different from what Washington thinks of Huawei, and given that the Europeans have said this, could we see more cooperation in, I guess, in dealing with other major international issues like climate change or international security or the fight on terrorism?
Oh, certainly on things like on climate change and all, the two parties are very engaged in trying to work together. But on stuff like Huawei, which divides the two countries, still the EU has taken a very considered view. What it's trying to do is, in essence, trying to grapple with 5G and try to understand what is the core backbone telecoms infrastructure that needs protection, and not just have an overly broad security perspective, which kind of squashes innovation in that sector. So and even the United Kingdom is going down that route, and I think it's highly welcome. And I'd hope this will help. The sense of independent-mindedness in Europe's part will also be a check somewhat on Washington in trying to think through these issues with a greater degree of nuance.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.